Thank you, Nikki, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Thank you very much to Björn and to Tim for reaching out to CERN to be part of this session. And as Nikki was already saying, we're not looking at this presentation as a way to copy, but to inspire and hopefully to enrich the discussions that are in any case already taking place. And thank you very much to Peter Bauer for making such a good bridge, I think, to these presentations in terms of the aspects of governance that are important to think about. And I'll just make sure that I time myself so that we don't end up with a presentation that goes until dinner. Now, for those of you who don't know CERN, I realized today, thank you very much, that there's a CERN in China. I don't know whether there's a copyright issue that we need to look into, but I was somewhat surprised to see this. But CERN, the CERN that I know and work for, is the world's biggest laboratory for particle physics, straddling the border between Switzerland and France. This was already mentioned, and it's really dedicated to understanding the most fundamental particles and the laws of the universe. And there are 4 pillars to our mission. First and foremost, fundamental research in particle physics. In order to answer these questions in physics, we need to innovate. We create cutting-edge technologies that allow us to bring the knowledge forward. All of this is carried forward by a very extensive international collaboration, and together the research, the technology development, and the collaboration model provides a particularly rich framework for education of the next generation of physicists, engineers, IT professionals, and many, many others. And I will today focus specifically on the governance and structure of CERN as an intergovernmental organization, and also on the CERN experiment. So this actually means that I focus specifically on 2 of the 2 missions, namely research and collaboration. So this doesn't mean that the technology and innovation part is not important, or education and training, but in order to focus the talk, I will specifically emphasize these dimensions. We work across 3 technological fields of activity: particle accelerators, particle detectors, and large-scale computing. And these 3 areas of activity are closely interrelated, while they actually have slightly different governance structures. And it's combined that these 3 components are the CERN model, which we often hear about, the CERN model for this, the CERN model for that. And it's important to see that there are different components to the CERN model of governance. It's also important to understand and have in mind the historical context within which CERN is embedded as an organization. It was founded in 1954, initially by 12 European member states, really under the banner of Science for Peace. It was the result of a common vision, a coming together of scientists and political leaders in post-war Europe, wishing to renew peaceful collaboration between European states, to create a glue, if you will, between nations and peoples that had been at war very recently, also to focus on fundamental research at a scale that simply was not possible for any one state alone, to also restore scientific excellence in a Europe that was devastated by war at the time, and to reverse and to prevent, in particular, the brain drain to the US. There was also some to the Soviet Union, but the main problem there was the US. The foundation of the governance is the CERN Convention. So this is an international treaty that's signed and ratified by all of the member states. And CERN was really the first intergovernmental organization with a scientific mission at the heart of it. The original convention was signed by the 12 original signatories in 1953. It has been updated only once. It's a very high bar. It's a little bit like trying to change the Charter of the United Nations. It's very, very difficult to do this, and also not necessarily advisable, because it's very difficult to see what you might get instead. CERN and this model of governance has been the model also for other intergovernmental organizations in science. We've mentioned several of them today: ESA, ESO, EMBL, SESAME, which is a synchrotron light source in the Middle East, and most recently the Square Kilometre Array, SKA. And the convention is a very important instrument because it has been very flexible over the years. It has allowed for the institution to evolve over time, to address new scientific challenges within the same framework. Now, the convention is the basis for our institutional relations and also the collaborations that we have in a global perspective. We have today 23 member states. They come together in the Council of CERN, and they make the decisions for the organization. We have institutional relations also with other states in different configurations. We have a number of states that are on the pathway to becoming member states. You see them here: Cyprus, Estonia, and Slovenia. Then we have associate member states that part of the CERN family, pay a limited amount to the CERN budget, also do not vote in the council. And then we have observers. So these are either countries, states, or institutions with which CERN has had a particularly close relationship over the years. You see some of them here. You see also that the observer status of the Russian Federation is suspended now following the invasion of Ukraine. UNESCO is there because CERN was born under the auspices of UNESCO in the 50s. We also have collaboration agreements with about 50 non-member states and territories, so this allows us also to have a very dense network of global collaboration beyond the core of the member states and the associate member states. I want to just also highlight here in particular the user community. About 3,500 people are employed by CERN running the infrastructure, but the most important here is really the user community, and I'll come back to those in a little bit more detail later. The governance of CERN as an intergovernmental organization is really led by the council, by our member states. This is a supreme decision-making body, and you see here with a number of subordinate bodies that you can see the legend there. I don't necessarily want to go into them. And then, of course, an implementing management structure led by our Director General, Fabiola Gianotti, who has been our Director General since 2016. Let's see if we can move forward. So, just to make sure that I got the right one. So, the CERN Convention stipulates that we operate particle accelerators and the necessary ancillary apparatus, which is a fantastic term, for the use in the research programs. And in terms of the funding of this, since the 1980s, the model has been that the accelerators are funded from the CERN budget. So this is from the member state contributions, and also to some extent by the associate member states, and also by project contributions from non-member states. So certain states have stepped up, such as the US, Japan, and others, for the construction of the Large Hadron Collider, and this is the funding model for the accelerators and the infrastructure. But the experiments that run off the accelerator are actually constructed through in-kind contributions, in particular by institutes in member states and non-member states. And the experiments are operated jointly by the collaborating institutes in this model, and are then supported by a maintenance and operations budget financed by the institutes that participate. So there are effectively two streams of funding. One within the intergovernmental organization that funds the infrastructure, and then a funding stream and a funding model for the experiments. They feed off each other, and you see that CERN is actually one of the institutes within the collaboration. So CERN is both host lab and a participant in the experiments. You see here the accelerator complex that is run by the organization. This is what is funded through the member state contributions, and you see that the complex has been evolving over the years within this budget, and we're still using accelerators from the 50s, so we reuse. It's a great way of recycling that previous accelerators become injectors for the next generation of accelerators, and this is how we then accelerate the particles to run into the Large Hadron Collider. So the accelerator funded by the member states. Then this is our flagship accelerator, the Large Hadron Collider, 27 kilometers in circumference, about 100 meters underground, border between Switzerland and France. And on this infrastructure sits a number of experiments, in particular the four large experiments on the LHC. You see them here: ALICE, ATLAS, CMS, and LHCb. And you also see that they have very, very large communities behind them, between 1,500 scientists working together in LHCb, up to just above 3,000 in ATLAS and CMS. And it was ATLAS and CMS, the two general purpose experiments, that demonstrated the existence of the Higgs boson. And it's 11 years ago today that we were able to announce that at CERN. So the 4th of July may be important in the US, but for us it has a very different connotation. Now, for the experiments, there's a very, very large user community. This is the 12,000 to 13,000 scientists that are not employed by CERN as an institution, but by their home institutes. About half of them come from our member states, very large proportion also from the associate member states, very large communities from the observer states, and then about 10%, and I think this is particularly interesting in a global perspective, from non-member states. The experimental collaborations are basically associations of interested physicists that initially form a proto-collaboration, propose an experimental setup that is deemed capable of carrying out a measurement and a program of interest using the infrastructure at CERN. Once this has been approved, the physicists constitute a formal collaboration in order to build and operate and analyze and publish the data that comes out of the experiment. They are effectively, these collaborations, models of consensus building, also competition between them, and of course also cooperation. They are very open. New institutes may join following a well-defined procedure, can vary from experiment to experiment. But importantly, it is not necessarily the same membership as the organization. So there's a wider membership and a larger number of countries working within the experiments in this very open structure than within the intergovernmental organization itself. Participation in the experiments at CERN are governed by what's called the general conditions. This is the legally binding document and the framework for collaborating. It sets out the rules for the users and describe also the host lab responsibilities that CERN has. This is then, it's possible for institutes to join this through a memorandum of understanding. And they set out the responsibilities that an individual institute wishes to take on for construction, operation, and also dismantling of the experiment. And the funding agencies have direct oversight of their funding through what's called the Resources Review Board. In terms of how the experiments are organized, you see here an example. This is the ATLAS experiment. And you can see here a quite sort of a distributed model. It's quite flat in terms of hierarchy. Very broad engagement by the participating institutes, for example, through the plenary that meets once a year, the collaboration board also. Groups of institutes then come together to build part of the detectors, and data is available to all the physicists for analysis, and they're organized then in dedicated working groups focused on very different types of physics phenomena. This is led by, and this I think is very interesting, by a spokesperson. The spokesperson is elected by the collaboration, so there's an element of trust. It is effectively a CEO of the collaboration for the time that the spokesperson serves, but it's a very democratic way of saying this person speaks for the collaboration, but it's the collaboration that makes the decisions in a collaborative manner. In terms of approval, review, and monitoring, this is also very tightly organized with a lot of peer review and a lot of scrutiny, many levels. For each of the clusters of experiments, there is a scientific committee that is chaired by the Director for Research. This is my colleague, Joachim Nich. And these scientific committees are composed of international independent experts that peer review proposals and also the progress reports that come from the experiments. This allows them to measure against milestones that are set out when the experiment was founded. Problems can be flagged to the funding agencies and also to the CERN management for picking this up. And they then report to various committees, including the Research Board. And the Research Board is a CERN body that is chaired by the Director General, brings together the management of CERN, and looks at the scientific recommendations that come from the scientific committee, but then also takes in consideration the financial situation of the experiment, but also the resource implications for CERN as a host lab. So you have the physics case and the physics considerations, but also the technical constraints and the financing considerations that come from the host lab. And the final decision about whether to fund and take aboard an experiment actually rests with the council. So in the final analysis, the decisions are made by the member states. So this is I love this. It looks enormously complex, but it's actually a way of showing how the different streams of decision making come together and the scrutiny that takes place and the cross-fertilization between these different bodies in terms of the scientific assessment, the scrutiny also on the financial side, and then all of it eventually ends up in the CERN Council because that's where the decisions are made. Now, we have the accelerators, we have the experiments, and then we also have, of course, the large amounts of data that come out of this. This is distributed in the worldwide LHC computing grid, the WLCG, which is a network computing infrastructure, also effectively structured as a collaboration, coordinated through CERN, and this is used to store, distribute, process, and analyze data. Currently, about 1 million processing cores in 170, give or take one, data centers in over 40 countries in the world, more than 1,000 petabytes of data stored worldwide in the WLCG structure. I wanted just to say a few words about priority setting and strategizing, because I think that's particularly interesting when we talk about governance. It's also about being governed. What are the scientific priorities that a community wishes to come together around? And the field of particle physics in Europe works in alignment with what's called the European Strategy for Particle Physics, and it's a process through which every 5 to 7 years the community will come together to update its priorities and strategize for the field. The first strategy was compiled in 2006, updated the first time in 2013, and then the second update came in 2020. And this is a process that is launched and adopted by the CERN Council, so it's overseen by the Council, but it is a bottom-up process that involves all of the community. It's driven by physics and by physics cases, but with awareness of the technical feasibility and also the financial constraints that are there. So it's a roadmap that is done by the European community, but in a global context. So they're also within the strategy process, which is a complex structure. There are also participation, for example, from the US, from Asia, and other parts of the world. And you see there on the right, I'll just see maybe if I can make this work. You can see some of the milestones here, those that are highlighted in orange, that I think are particularly interesting. So formally, the process last time was launched in 2018 in September. And here, the entire community is invited to provide input to the process, and then that leads to, for example, national consultation processes, and national communities will provide input into the process. CERN does as well. We had some design studies that were part of the process, and all of this gets compiled. You see here that then it was possible to do this until December of 2018. Then all of the community came together, 600 to 700 people, in an open symposium discussing the different inputs. Very, very interesting week in Granada at the time. And all of this feeds into what's called the physics briefing book, which is collecting all of the input and all of the physics cases. And all of this then gets distilled into a strategy drafting session, so a smaller group where each member state also has nominated representatives and their community representatives. They sit together, it's a little bit like a conclave, and after a week, hopefully the smoke is white and they come out and they have a strategy. And this is a very complex exercise, very tense, lots of discussions, but eventually there will be consensus in the conclave, and then the strategy is then submitted to council and adopted by the council itself. So you see a very interesting interplay between the bottom-up process, but then also overseen by the council, because at the end of the day, it's the council that adopts it. This is a roadmap, and it is not resource-loaded. Individual projects within the strategy will have to be adopted, for example, through the budgetary process at CERN subsequently. And one of the important outcomes of the last strategy session was the task to the CERN management to conduct what's called a feasibility study for a potential future circular collider, 100-kilometer ring also in the Geneva Basin. And that feasibility study is now ongoing and will be an input to the next strategy update. So I want to, just before concluding with a couple of reflections, just highlight values, because I think one of the aspects that has really sustained CERN over time is the way that the community has come together around core values that they share. And one of them, I think maybe the most important one, is open science. We've talked a lot about that today also. According to the convention, this is not a new thing. This is already in our founding document from 1954. First of all, of course, the organizations have no concern with work for military requirements. This is fully understandable after the Second World War. And the results of its experimental and theoretical work shall be published or otherwise made generally available. So by convention and by conviction, open science is how we work. And this has then been transformed into various policy documents and open access policy. About 90% of the research that's produced at CERN is published open access. We have created a sponsoring consortium for open access publishing, and of course also inspired other open access initiatives. We have an open data policy concerning the release of the data, with of course certain limitations because the experiments want to use the data first, but then it's also released. And all of this has now been collected in an open science policy, which is an overarching document adopted in 2022 that specifically also refers to open software, open hardware, and also education, training, outreach, and citizen science. So just to conclude, before I hand over to Nikki to moderate the discussion, a couple of reflections in terms of what has served CERN well. This is not to say that this is something that can be copied specifically, but I think these are elements and aspects that have been particularly valuable for the CERN model over the years. I think what is important here is that the governance model has shown itself to be extremely sustainable over time. It has not been necessary to adjust it too much. We still work by the convention, and it has shown itself to be flexible enough to adapt, and to adapt to a situation in 2023 that looks very different to 1954. It has allowed us to evolve with the science, but also allowed stability and, most importantly, sustained funding through the regular contributions of the member states. The governance of the experiments have also been very, very successful, having grown from very small experiments with tens of scientists in the 60s to now large collaborations that have more than thousands of scientists working together. Very much built around principles of fair sharing, joint physics goals, and also, of course, also a very shared determination to succeed. The monitoring of the scientific achievements, the scientific efforts, and also the efficient use of the resources involves committees with international experts that are not necessarily connected to the lab itself. Very importantly, you open up, you have transparency, and allow a strong oversight through these committees. And I think most importantly, and above all of this, the collaboration has been carried by shared values. The experiment results, data, technology, the World Wide Web, it's all made available in the spirit of open science. So I'll stop there and I'll hand over to you.